Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this baseline expectation of precision.
Right, it's like engineering.
Exactly like engineering. Like you break your arm, you go to the hospital, the x-ray shows that jagged white line on the bone, and the doctor just points to the screen and says, well, there it is.
It's completely binary. It is undeniably visible. And because we can see it, we know exactly what protocol to use to fix it.
Right. Broken or not broken. It's clean. And we love that. We love being able to point to the exact spot where a complex system just, failed.
Yeah.
But then you step into the world of modern corporate management, you look at organizational health, and suddenly that x-ray machine is just completely broken.
Oh, completely.
We are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is honestly just murky. It's filled with guesswork. We look at failing companies, and instead of pointing to a physical fracture, we talk about like toxic vibes or bad culture.
Which is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. We use these soft, nebulous terms because we lack a hard physical framework for what is actually happening. And frankly, relying on vibes to diagnose a failing enterprise is a very, very expensive delusion.
Expensive might be the understatement of the century, honestly. I mean, think about the cubicle next to you right now, or the person on your next video call. In those exact spaces, the global economy is actively hemorrhaging $9.6 trillion.
It's a staggering number.
It's roughly 9% of the entire global GDP. And this isn't money lost to theft or, a supply chain disruption.
Yeah.
It's not a market crash. It is literally evaporating into the void from the sheer friction of human beings just trying to work together.
I think we need to ground that number immediately because that $9.6 trillion gap is not some theoretical economic projection.
No.
It is a literal thermodynamic cost. It is the price of operating modern enterprises without any grounding in physical reality.
Wow.
We are looking at a massive structural energy leak occurring at a global scale.
Which brings us to the ultimate mission of our deep dive today. Welcome back, everyone. This is part 8 of 8. We have finally reached the grand finale of our structural diagnostic journey.
It's been a long road.
It really has. We spent the last 7 deep dives dismantling the way we think about work, and today, the goal is to completely and permanently kill the concept of sociological alchemy.
It's long overdue.
Yeah.
I mean, the reliance on heuristic poetry, storytelling, and emotional intelligence to somehow fix broken physical systems, it just has to end.
Yeah.
It's mathematically bankrupt.
So today, we are diving into the final chapters of Juha Huttunen's proprietary framework, Organizational Multiphysics. We're pulling together his macroeconomic evaluations, the strict mathematical proofs of something he calls Negentropic Stability, and the exact biophysical interventions required to save an organization from, dielectric breakdown.
Yes.
Okay, let's unpack this, because we have been building up to this exact physics lesson for weeks.
Well, if we look at how businesses try to stop this $9.6 trillion leak right now, it becomes almost comical.
Oh, it's painful to watch.
Leadership continuously tries to solve a thermodynamic leak with that heuristic poetry we just mentioned.
Yeah, right.
Imagine you are standing in front of a massive suspension bridge. It's vibrating violently in the wind. The resonance is completely out of control, the steel cables are snapping, and the entire structure is about to collapse right into the river.
Okay. Terrifying visual, but I'm with you.
And instead of hiring a structural engineer to recalculate the tension and, fix the resonance, you hire a storyteller to come out and read the bridge, a poem about resilience.
Or you buy the bridge a ping pong table for the break room.
Yeah.
And maybe offer it a Friday pizza party.
Exactly.
It's so absurd when you say it out loud like that, but that is exactly what human resources departments do.
It is entirely absurd. Yet when a workforce is vibrating out of control and snapping under the pressure of terrible operational architecture, we send in a consultant to do a mindfulness seminar.
It's just nuts. So, to get out of this trap, the source material argues that before we can introduce the final law that actually saves an organization, we have to fundamentally redefine what an organization actually is in the physical universe.
Right.
And to do that, Huttun brings back our favorite theoretical executive from his framework, CEO 8.
CEO 8 is the perfect avatar for this epistemic transition. He represents the executive who finally wakes up to the physics of the room.
I loved this opening scenario in the notes. So the scene opens with 8 sitting at his desk at 9:00 a.m. He's reviewing this massive $2 million proposal from one of those premier legacy management consultancies.
We all know the type.
Oh, yeah. Glossy cover, lots of buzzwords. And for $2 million, this firm is promising to raise his corporation's global employee engagement through a strategic culture transformation initiative.
Right.
They want to run storytelling workshops, purpose-driven leadership seminars, and emotional intelligence coaching across the whole company.
It is the standard playbook. And for most legacy executives, they would sign that check because it feels like they're doing something meaningful.
But 8 just takes the glossy $2 million prospectus and drops it directly into the shredder.
He has to. Because, as he tells the lead partner of this consultancy later, they are attempting to solve a thermodynamic leak with poetry.
Yeah.
He rejects it on the grounds that culture is not a primary driver of a company. Culture is a trailing indicator of physics.
That line really stuck with me. Culture is a trailing indicator of physics. It makes so much sense. If your culture is toxic, if everyone is backstabbing each other and completely burned out, it's not because you hired bad people.
No, not at all.
It's because your physics are broken. The physical structure of the work is creating the toxicity.
Precisely.
So if we can't look at a company as a culture, what are the physics of a corporation? Huttuner relies on the Nobel laureate Ilya Prigogine to redefine the enterprise. He calls it an open-dissipative structure.
And I wouldn't just call it a redefinition. It is a profound application of Prigogine's Nobel-winning work in chemistry.
Okay.
An open-dissipative structure is a highly complex system that operates very, very far from thermodynamic equilibrium.
Wait. What does far from equilibrium look like in the real world? Give me an example.
Think of a hurricane forming over the warm waters of the Atlantic, or even just a living biological cell inside your body.
Okay.
To survive, these structures cannot be static. The moment a hurricane reaches equilibrium with the surrounding air, it vanishes. It dies.
Right. It just dissipates.
Exactly. So, to keep existing, these structures must continuously do 3 things. First, they must import high-grade free energy from their environment.
Okay.
Second, they must use that energy to maintain a highly ordered internal architecture. And third, they must aggressively expel degraded waste heat, which is entropy, back out into the void.
So a company is literally a hurricane. It breathes in capital, talent, natural resources. It does the mechanical work to keep its corporate structure spinning. Yeah. And it absolutely has to vent out the exhaust, the failed projects, the bad processes, the obsolete software, the interpersonal friction.
That's the exact mechanism.
Yeah.
And to truly understand this mechanical breathing, we have to look at the energy states inside the hurricane.
Right.
The source text makes a rigid, almost unforgiving distinction between 3 concepts here: enthalpy, exergy, and energy.
Okay, I spent a lot of time on this section because it flips the way we value companies completely on its head. Let's start with enthalpy.
So enthalpy is your total raw energy.
Just the raw fuel.
Right. In a corporate setting, it's your total payroll, your Series C venture capital funding, your office buildings, the sheer mass of resources you have sitting in the bank.
Okay.
Legacy management absolutely worships enthalpy. They look at a company with $1 billion in the bank and 1,000 engineers, and they think, well, that is a powerful, successful company.
Because bigger numbers just feel safer, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But physics tells us something entirely different. Having energy doesn't mean you can do work. What actually matters is exergy.
Exergy. The useful stuff.
Yes. Exergy is the extractable kinetic potential of that energy. It's the fraction of your resources that can actually be converted into forward spatial displacement.
Meaning it's the part that actually builds the product, ships the code, and secures the market share.
Precisely.
Okay, so if enthalpy is the raw fuel and exergy is the actual forward movement of the car, what determines how much enthalpy gets converted into exergy? Because I've seen startups with barely any funding completely outmaneuver massive corporations that have billions in the bank.
And that happens because of the internal structural order of the system.
Right.
If the internal systemic disorder of a company is high, like if you have 9 layers of middle management, endless approval matrices, conflicting goals, constant meetings, your exergy drops towards 0.
Wow.
It literally doesn't matter how much enthalpy you dump into the system at that point. The energy cannot produce forward momentum because it's caught in the internal friction.
It's just burning up.
Exactly. And when energy degrades inside a system without producing work, it turns into our third term, energy.
Energy. Irreversible, unrecoverable waste heat.
It is the literal physical burning of your capital with 0 forward momentum.
Yeah.
It is the $9.6 trillion we talked about at the top of the show.
Man, this completely reframes the whole employee perks debate for me. All those ping pong tables, the Friday pizza parties, the company-paid meditation apps, they're actually blinding leaders to structural collapse.
They really are.
Because if your company is generating massive energy, if the internal friction is destroying the workers, putting a ping pong table in the break room is like trying to cure a seized engine block by pouring premium aviation fuel into the gas tank.
That's a great analogy.
You can pump all the enthalpy you want into a seized engine, but if the pistons are locked by internal friction, the car isn't moving, the engine just heats up, it vibrates, and eventually it just melts.
That is the exact physical reality. Pouring premium fuel into a broken machine doesn't fix the machine. It just makes the eventual explosion more energetic.
Oh, that's dark, but true.
And this exposes a really dangerous delusion in modern corporate culture. The obsession with perfect comfort. You see this constantly on professional networking sites, right? Leaders bragging, we want a stress-free culture, or we want our ecosystem to be perfectly balanced and comfortable for everyone.
Yeah, the dream of the utopian office, where nobody ever feels any pressure, everyone is perfectly happy, and work is just this seamless breeze.
But if we go back to classical physics, total thermodynamic equilibrium, which is a state of perfect balance and comfort with the environment, is synonymous with death.
Wait, really? Death?
Yes. If a biological organism slides into perfect balance with its environment, it means its cells have stopped transferring energy. It is dead.
Oh, wow.
A system requires a pressure gradient to produce kinetic work. You cannot have a high-functioning open-dissipative structure without tension, without a differential, and without massive energetic throughput.
So when executives mathematically optimize for a stress-free culture, they aren't building a utopia at all. They are mathematically optimizing for the death of the firm. They are turning off the hurricane.
They are. And the global telemetry data we have right now proves this is happening.
Yeah.
The sources point to a catastrophic structural failure across the modern enterprise.
Yeah, let's look at the numbers.
We currently have a 21% global engagement rate. Legacy HR looks at that and says, oh, we have an engagement problem. Let's send out a survey.
Right.
Physics looks at a 21% engagement rate and says, you have a critical loss of systemic phase coherence. The structure is literally unspooling.
And what about the turnover rates? I mean, we're sitting at what, a 51 to 52% active turnover rate globally? People are constantly job hunting, constantly leaving.
HR calls that quiet quitting or a retention issue. And they try to fix it with, better onboarding.
Or more pizza.
Right. Physics calls it macro-scale structural material rupture. The biological nodes the human beings are physically shattering under the pressure of the unmanaged system.
Yeah.
They aren't just quitting. They're breaking off from the structure because the internal friction is too hot.
Okay, so we've established the absolute terror of the situation. The company is an open-dissipative structure. It is hemorrhaging $9.6 trillion in Exergy, and it is sliding toward thermodynamic heat death because the leaders are trying to fix a seized engine with poetry.
Yes.
So how do we stop it? Because as we've established, a bigger meditation budget isn't going to fix a material rupture. We need actual mechanics.
Right. To arrest this decay, Huttinen introduces the ultimate unifying law of the entire framework. This is what everything we've discussed over the last 7 deep dives has been building toward.
Here we go.
The Law of Negentropic Stability.
The Law of Negentropic Stability. Let's carve this into stone right now. What is the actual definition?
The law states that an organization must continuously balance the importation of negentropy against its internal mechanical strain.
Okay, I want to take this apart piece by piece because this scale, negentropy on one side, mechanical strain on the other, is the key to everything. Let's start with negentropy, negative entropy. I know you said earlier that it's not just throwing cash at a problem, but what does it actually look like in a boardroom?
It requires a massive shift in executive behavior. In physics, negentropy is the importation of highly ordered energy to reverse entropic decay.
Okay.
In corporate terms, think about a chaotic, completely disorganized project team that is missing deadlines and fighting internally. If you just authorize a $1 million budget increase for that team, you haven't added negentropy. You've actually just added more enthalpy to the chaos.
You just threw a bucket of gasoline on a grease fire.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Now they have $1 million to fight over and create even more overlapping processes.
Right.
Corporate negentropy is the architectural alignment of the enterprise via pure, ruthlessly prioritized directives that completely eliminate ambiguity.
Eliminate ambiguity.
Yes, it is the strict, unyielding filtering of noise. Negentropy is leadership deciding exactly what the company will not do, thereby providing perfect structural clarity to the human nodes inside the system.
So it's subtraction, almost.
It's the removal of choices that don't matter, so the system can focus its energy on the choices that do.
Okay, so negentropy is extreme, ruthless clarity. It's order. Now, what is the mechanical strain that this clarity is supposed to be balancing against? Because the source text uses the Greek letter epsilon for strain, and it brings in engineering math.
Right. In engineering mechanics, mechanical strain, represented by epsilon, is calculated as the change in length divided by the original length, delta L over L.
Okay, what does that mean practically?
It measures the physical deformation of a material relative to its original state when subjected to external loads. If you hang a heavy weight from a steel cable, the cable stretches. That stretches the strain.
So if we apply that to a human being sitting at a desk...
Within a business, every single new product line you launch, every strategic pivot you announce in an all-hands meeting, every sudden demand from a client that requires an employee to expend biological ATP places literal mechanical strain on that human node. You are structurally stretching the employee.
Man, I'm picturing a manager casually walking by a desk and saying, hey, can you take on this quick new initiative for Q3? They think it's just a simple ask.
Yeah.
But physically, they are grabbing the employee and stretching them. They are deforming the workforce.
Every strategic decision an executive makes is a thermodynamic event. It has a physical cost. If you stretch the material, if you increase the mechanical strain, epsilon, without supplying a mathematically proportional influx of structured negentropy, the system experiences unsustainable deformation.
You are stretching the cable without reinforcing it.
Exactly.
And what happens if they keep pulling? If they just keep adding initiatives without providing clarity? What happens when a human node is pushed past its elastic limit?
Well, you see this in material science all the time. When a material is pushed past its yield strength or its elastic limit, the physical deformation ceases to be reversible. The material cannot return to its original shape. It is permanently warped. In a corporation, when you push the biological nodes past their elastic limit, the employees simply shatter. They suffer absolute, permanent operational rupture.
We just call it burnout.
We call it burnout, yeah. But we treat burnout like a temporary psychological state. Physics says it is a permanent structural failure of the material.
Wow. So throwing money at a chaotic project doesn't add negentropy, it just accelerates the chaos. The strain snaps the people. But why does the strain snap them so violently? I was reading the notes, and it seems like the strain doesn't just go up a little bit when you add a new task. It explodes. The math gets incredibly aggressive.
The reason the strain snaps people so violently isn't just because the tasks themselves are difficult. I mean, digging a ditch is difficult, but it doesn't cause dielectric breakdown.
Right.
The breakdown occurs because of the physical architecture of human communication. Adding tasks for people doesn't increase strain linearly. It explodes it exponentially because of the ON squared topological constraint.
Okay, the ON squared constraint. This is where the math becomes the stuff of absolute nightmares for anyone who has ever tried to scale a startup or even just manage a large team. I really want to dig into this combinatorial explosion. Walk us through how this scaling actually works.
The core physical limitation of any organization is that as you add nodes, and a node could be a person, a team, or a product line, the complexity of communication does not grow in a straight linear line. It scales quadratically.
Okay.
The mathematical formula is E equals N times N minus 1 divided by 2.
Where E is the number of communication edges and N is the number of nodes.
Right. And to really feel the terror of this equation, we have to look at the three distinct physical states of human coordination that the text outlines.
Let's role play this out so we can visualize it. Let's
Right.
say you and I start a company in a garage, just the two of us. The text calls this state 1, the dyad.
The dyad, N equals 2. If you plug 2 into the formula, 2 times 1 divided by 2, you get exactly one communication edge, the space between you and me.
Which is trivial coordination. There is near zero administrative friction. If we need to clarify something, I just look across the desk and say, hey, are we using the blue logo or the red logo? You say blue, done. Zero heat waste.
Yeah.
Negentropic stability is naturally maintained.
It's a perfectly efficient physical system.
Yeah.
But let's say the company gets a little funding, you hire 3 more people. Now we hit state 2. The text calls this the biological ceiling.
State 2 is where N equals 5, the maximum viable clique.
If you plug 5 nodes into the equation, the required communication edges jump to 10. Every single person in that group of 5 must maintain active, empathetic, relational bandwidth with 4 other people constantly. 10 independent lines of communication crossing over each other.
It's manageable, but you can feel the heat starting to generate. You can't just yell across the desk anymore because two people might be having a completely different conversation. You start needing a dedicated Slack channel. You need a weekly alignment meeting.
Exactly. The administrative overhead begins.
Yeah.
But a 5-person company is still fluid. Anthropologically, the human brain evolved to manage a small hunting or gathering group of this size.
Right.
It is the absolute upper limit of fluid human coordination before alignment requires heavy, dedicated administrative structures.
But no startup wants to stay at 5 people. They want to scale. They get a huge Series A round. They hire a bunch of specialists. They spin up new departments. They hit state 3. And this is where the physics literally tear the company apart. The text calls this cognitive gridlock.
State 3 is where n equals 15. Think of a marketing department with 15 interlocking teams, or a mid-sized company with 15 different product lines.
Okay.
When n is 15, the communication edges don't just triple from our group of 5. Yeah. The formula, 15 times 14 divided by 2, means the communication edges explode to 105.
105 distinct, overlapping, chaotic lines of communication.
It is a massive tangled web. And here is the physical reality that legacy HR completely ignores. It is mathematically impossible for a biological computing array, which is what a human brain is, to process the sheer entropy of a 105-edge network without suffering severe structural damage.
When I was looking at these notes, thinking about those 105 edges, it actually reminded me of trying to fly a plane faster.
How so?
Well, if you look at the aerodynamic drag equation in fluid dynamics, the drag force doesn't just increase as you speed up. It is proportional to the square of your velocity. The harder you push the engines, the more violently the air friction pushes back against the plane. It squares.
That is a perfect physical analogy. In a highly dense ON squared network, the administrative drag force squares.
It's like looking at an airplane with 105 parachutes tied to the back of it, and the pilot's only solution is to scream at the engines to push harder. Yeah. If an executive demands 3 times the speed from a workforce trapped in a structurally dense, viscous environment with 105 overlapping communication edges, the destructive friction doesn't just go up by 3, it creates 9 times the destructive friction. The pilot is screaming for velocity, and the friction is literally going to rip the wings off the plane.
That is exactly what happens. The engineers or the marketers aren't failing because they lack synergy.
No.
They aren't failing because they have a bad attitude or because they didn't pay attention during the core value seminar.
Yeah.
They are physically gridlocked by the topology of the system. They are drowning in a sea of 105 communication edges. The friction is tearing the material apart.
Okay, so we've outlined the nightmare. We have a workforce approaching dielectric breakdown because they are trapped in this ON squared combinatorial explosion. The friction is squaring. How does a leader actually physically protect their biological computing array?
To save the nodes, the executive must execute intervention 1. The leader must step in and become a thermodynamic filter. They must become Maxwell's demon.
Okay, Maxwell's demon. This is a concept from 1867. I love when we pull 19th century physics into modern business.
It's surprisingly relevant.
Explain this thought experiment for us, because at first glance, it sounds like literal magic.
In 1867, the physicist James Clerk Maxwell proposed a puzzle to challenge the second law of thermodynamics, which basically says entropy or chaos always increases.
Right.
Maxwell envisioned a microscopic entity, a demon guarding a tiny door between 2 chambers of gas. By measuring the speed of individual molecules, the demon selectively opens and closes the door. It sorts the fast, hot molecules into one chamber and the slow, cold molecules into the other.
So you start with a chaotic room of mixed temperatures, and the demon perfectly organizes it into a hot room and a cold room. It creates perfect order out of chaos, seemingly without doing any physical work.
Right. It confounded physicists for nearly a century. Because if the demon could do that without expending energy, it would violate the fundamental laws of the universe. It would mean you could reverse entropy for free.
But you can't.
No. It wasn't until 1961 that a physicist named Rolf Landauer finally cracked the puzzle. He formulated what we now call Landauer's principle.
I was reading this, and it was such a light bulb moment. Landauer proved the demon wasn't magic at all. There was a catch. The demon was paying a hidden cost.
Exactly. Landauer proved that in order to continuously sort those molecules, the demon had to store information about their speeds and eventually had to erase its memory to make room for new information.
Right.
And that act, the physical erasure of information from a system, requires a minimum energy dissipation, specifically kdt natural log of 2 joules per bit.
The act of erasing information expels heat. Information is physical.
It is entirely physical.
Huh.
Processing and erasing information carries a strict thermodynamic price. And when we apply this to the biological computing array of the human brain, that price is exorbitant.
Oh, I bet.
The brain operates way above Landauer's theoretical minimum limit. The biophysics are staggering. Synaptic modification requires thousands of ATP molecules per event. A single action potential in a mammalian cortical cell costs roughly 700 million ATP molecules.
700 million ATP molecules for one action potential, just to fire one signal. That means even thinking transforms physical structure. Even knowing something or forgetting something has a literal metabolic thermodynamic cost.
Which means we have to rethink what happens when an employee sits down at their desk. Every time an employee opens their inbox and have to parse an ambiguous directive from their boss, or every time they have to task switch between 15 overlapping priorities or try to navigate those 105 communication edges to figure out who is in charge of a project, they're being forced to act as Maxwell's demon.
Oh my God, they are the ones sorting the hot and cold molecules.
Yes, they are burning massive, finite reserves of cellular ATP just to sort through the corporate chaos. They are paying the Landauer erasure cost with their own biology.
This perfectly explains that feeling at 4:00 p.m. where you haven't actually produced anything all day. You haven't written any code, you haven't designed any graphics, but you are physically bone-deep exhausted.
Yes.
You spent the entire day just trying to figure out what you were supposed to do. You spent all your ATP erasing noise.
That relentless drain is what we call decision fatigue, cognitive depletion, and eventually burnout. Pushing decision-making and ambiguity down the hierarchy without supplying negentropy is an abdication of physical responsibility by the executive layer. It literally boils the biological nodes.
So intervention one is that executives need to stop acting as motivational speakers and start acting as the demon.
Exactly.
They must stand at the boundary of the organization, absorb the chaotic noise of the market, pay the thermodynamic cost of sorting it, and hand down purely structured negentropy so the workers don't have to burn their ATP guessing what matters. The executive has to take the heat.
That is exactly right. A true executive absorbs the entropy. Filter the chaos at the boundary is step one, but step two requires respecting the strict capacity limits of the human nodes inside the boundary.
Right, because once you filter the work, how much work can you actually give them?
Exactly. Which brings us to intervention two, capping utilization.
The corporate obsession with 100% capacity. I know so many managers who think that if their team isn't furiously typing on their keyboards for 8 hours a day, they are wasting company money. They want maximum utilization.
And that belief is a mathematical death sentence for any open-dissipative structure. To understand why, we must revisit Kingman's formula. We touched on this in an earlier deep dive, but the critical mechanism here is the utilization factor, represented by the Greek letter rho.
Okay.
The formula calculating Q wait times includes a specific fraction, rho divided by 1 minus rho.
Let's walk through that fraction, because the math is terrifying. As utilization, rho approaches 1, which is 100% capacity. The denominator of that fraction, 1 minus rho, approaches 0.
And in mathematics, when you divide a number by a value approaching 0, the result exponentially diverges toward infinity. Wait times do not scale linearly with workload. They explode.
Give me an example.
Well, if you're operating at 80% utilization, rho is 0.8. So the fraction is 0.8 divided by 0.2, which equals 4. The multiplier is 4.
But if you push that team to 95% utilization?
If rho at 0.95, the fraction is 0.95 divided by 0.05. The multiplier shoots up to 19.
Holy cow.
The wait time of the system didn't go up by 15%. It increased almost fivefold. At high utilization, even the slightest burst of variance, a delayed email, a sick employee, a sudden market shift, causes the queue to explode across the entire ON-squared network topology. Everything gridlocks instantly.
So human nodes must be mathematically capped strictly below 80 to 85% to provide strategic slack. You have to leave empty space in the system to absorb variance, or the whole thing freezes up.
Yes. Idle time is not waste. It is the physical shock absorber of the enterprise. And this dovetails perfectly with intervention 3, calibrating to ANLS kinetic limits. This is where we stop looking at math and start looking at the literal biological fueling mechanisms of the brain.
The astrocyte neuron lactate shuttle, ANLS. What does this shuttle actually do when we are working?
Under standard low-demand conditions, the human brain runs quite happily on glucose. But when an organization demands high-velocity strategic pivots or deep, complex problem-solving, the metabolic requirement inside the skull spikes violently.
Okay.
Neurons experience massive sodium transients and need an extreme amount of ATP consumption to maintain their membrane potentials.
So the normal glucose delivery just isn't fast enough. The engine needs a supercharger.
Exactly. So the brain activates the ANLS, specialized glial cells called astrocytes step in. They rapidly convert glucose into lactate and shuttle it directly to the neurons.
Right.
The neurons rapidly metabolize this lactate to feed their mitochondrial respiratory chain, which produces the massive surge of ATP needed for peak cognitive computation.
But there has to be a physical limit to that system, right? I mean, you can't just run the supercharger forever.
There is a strict, non-negotiable kinetic limit. If the corporate demand for output exceeds the rate at which astrocytes can physically supply lactate, neuronal ATP levels crash below a critical threshold.
And what happens when the ATP crashes? Does the employee just drink an espresso and power through it with some grit?
No. Biology doesn't care about corporate grit or motivational quotes. When the ATP threshold is breached, the brain triggers an automatic depotentiation sequence. Information processing stops. Memory consolidation fails.
Wow.
The biological node forcefully shuts down to conserve energy and prevent structural cellular death.
Let me get this straight. When a manager forces a chaotic new workflow on an overworked team and an employee just stares blankly at the whiteboard during a 4 p.m. pivot meeting, completely unresponsive,
Yeah.
they aren't being stubborn. Their brain has literally thrown the circuit breaker to stop their cells from starving to death.
That is the physical reality.
And HR responds by hanging up a new core values poster in the break room about embracing change. It's wild.
It is tragic. Legacy executives completely mischaracterize this biological shutdown. They label it resistance to change or insubordination or a bad attitude, but it's none of those things. The theoretical neurobiologist Carl Friston provides the actual framework for this behavior. He calls it active inference.
Active inference. Let's dig into that.
Friston's framework dictates that all self-organizing biological systems seek to minimize what he calls variational free energy, which is basically a measure of surprise or uncertainty.
Okay.
By minimizing surprise, the organism resists the pull of the second law of thermodynamics. It avoids entropy. When chaotic high-entropy demands are forced on a worker without the executive providing negentropy, the worker's variational free energy spikes violently.
The environment becomes unpredictable and dangerous. And to prevent cellular starvation from exceeding those ANLS delivery limits, the biological system reverts to highly rigid, precise priors. It blocks out the chaotic sensory input. It seeks the path of least resistance to return to a steady state.
Resistance to change is not a cultural defect. It is a thermodynamic defense mechanism. You cannot overcome active inference with a compelling mission statement. You can only overcome it by lowering the variational free energy of the environment by supplying pure, structured negentropy.
Okay, we have walked through some incredibly dense physics today. We've covered the ON squared math, the Landauer Erasure costs, the Kingman limit, the ANLS shuttle. But I know that to really believe this, to see how the law of Negentropic stability operates flawlessly in the physical world, we need to look at a macro case study.
We do.
We need to see someone actually do this. So let's look at Apple in 1997.
This is perhaps the greatest real-world validation of organizational multiphysics in corporate history.
Set the scene for us. What was the thermodynamic state of Apple right before Steve Jobs returned?
By late 1997, Apple was in a state of terminal thermodynamic heat death. They had recorded $1.03 billion in operating losses. But the core cause wasn't a lack of engineering talent, and it wasn't a lack of brand recognition.
Right.
The collapse was caused by the unmanageable expansion of their ON squared network topology.
How bloated had the structure become?
Apple was trying to maintain roughly 15 distinct overlapping platforms simultaneously. They had Newton PDA, they had servers, they had printers, and they had over a dozen varied overlapping versions of the Macintosh computer alone. The Performa, the Quadra, the Power Mac, just trying to appease chaotic requests from different retail chains.
So if we plug that into our math, n equals 15, which means 15 times 14 divided by 2. That is 105 overlapping communication edges.
Yes, they had hit state 3, cognitive gridlock. The entire organization was collapsing under catastrophic mechanical strain.
105 edges, that's insane.
Every single engineering team was being forced to act as their own Maxwell's demon. They were expending vast amounts of ATP, trying to sort through conflicting executive directives, cannibalizing their own form factors, and trying to navigate a bloated, aimless strategy.
The Landauer Erasure cost across that campus must have been astronomical. The engineers were burning all their cellular energy just trying to figure out what they were supposed to build, rather than actually having the energy to build it.
Exactly.
And I'm guessing their utilization row was pushed way over the Kingman limit to try and compensate.
Oh, absolutely. Management was pushing them well above 90% capacity, so they were trapped in the exponential wait time gridlock. Nothing could move forward. They were completely unable to ship compelling products.
And then Steve Jobs returns, and he doesn't do what a legacy CEO would do. He doesn't call a firm to run a culture seminar. He doesn't ask for synergy. He didn't demand that the engineers push their utilization to 100% to code their way out of the billion-dollar deficit.
No. Jobs intuitively understood the physics. He stepped in and acted as the ultimate Maxwell's demon. He absorbed the massive systemic entropy at the executive boundary.
Walk us through what Huttunen calls the thermodynamic massacre.
Jobs famously stood in front of a whiteboard and violently filtered the chaos for the entire company. He drew a simple, strict 2x2 matrix. On one axis, he wrote, consumer and professional. On the other axis, desktop and portable.
4 quadrants, that's it.
4 quadrants. With that single physical intervention, Jobs executed a thermodynamic massacre. He killed 70% of Apple's chaotic product line in a matter of weeks. He killed the Newton, he killed the printers, the servers, and the dozen overlapping Macintosh variants.
Think about the math of what he just did. By deciding what not to do, he collapsed the topology. He took n from 15 down to 4, which means he reduced the communication edges from 105 down to exactly 6.
With one stroke of a dry erase marker, he eradicated 99 active vectors of systemic entropy. He absorbed the heat, and by doing so, he supplied pure, highly structured negentropy directly to the engineering core.
The Landauer erasure cost dropped to near 0 for the execution layer. The engineers no longer had to burn their ATP sorting through 15 platforms or fighting with other teams for resources. They just had to build 4 great machines.
This raises a profoundly uncomfortable question for modern leadership. How many executives today have the cold operational discipline to execute a massacre like that?
Very few, I bet.
If faced with 105 communication edges, most leaders today wouldn't destroy them. They would form a new committee to manage the 105 edges. They would hire a vice president of cross-functional alignment.
Which just adds another node. It makes the math worse.
Exactly.
But because Jobs actually cut the nodes, he protected the limits of the astrocyte neuron lactate shuttle. The cognitive load of the organization was optimized. The system regained temporal resonance. The enthalpy was converted purely into exergy and kinetic output. And the result. By protecting the biological computing power of his engineers, he turned a $1.03 billion loss into a $309 million profit in exactly 1 year. It directly paved the way for the iMac, the iBook, the iPod, pure kinetic velocity.
It is the ultimate historical proof that you cannot motivate your way out of a structural failure. You must architect your way out.
So across these 8 deep dives, we have successfully laid out the blueprint for stabilizing the biological core of your enterprise. We know the math. You know how to cap utilization below 80%. You know how to map your ON squared network. And you know how to act as Maxwell's demon at the boundary.
We've covered a lot of ground.
But the source material points out that as your company grows and connects these healthy nodes together, a terrifying new physical threshold approaches.
Securing the biological core is only step 1. There is a larger physics problem waiting in the wings.
This brings us to the final concept, surviving the coordination event horizon. This is a tease for what comes next because the source material points us toward volume 2 of this framework. But before we get there, there's a direct call to action for you, the listener.
Right. If you step away from this deep dive and return to your executive team tomorrow using the same qualitative HR surveys and the same heuristic poetry, you are actively choosing to remain operationally blind. You are choosing to fail. The author directs readers to fsisis.org to play the game of Fsiis.
Right. They have open source interactive infrastructure there. You can actually use the Kingman's Gridlock calculator to test your real utilization rates. You can run systemic friction audits. You have to measure the physics of your own organization.
You have to measure it, because if you don't, you will inevitably fall victim to what the upcoming Volume 2 calls the biological metaphor fallacy.
The biological metaphor fallacy. Let's unpack this to close us out, because it sounds like a trap a lot of founders fall into. Legacy consultants love to claim that organizations are like organisms. They say companies can scale organically, naturally, like a living ecosystem in a forest.
And that is mathematically invalid. It completely ignores the strict sublinear allometric constraints of Kleiber's law.
Kleiber's law! I love that we are bringing in scaling biology at the very end.
Kleiber's law basically shows that as animals get larger, their metabolism scales at a 3/4 power, not linearly, But treating a scaling enterprise like a frictionless machine or a boundless organism is dangerous. When you connect human nodes, communication does not scale linearly. It triggers that ON² combinatorial explosion we discussed.
And as your network scales from a mid-sized company into a megacorp, this explosion creates something horrifying: the coordination event horizon.
The coordination event horizon is the exact topological threshold, where the energy required simply to coordinate the ON² system equals the total exergy generated by it. When that happens, your net kinetic output is reduced to absolute zero.
The coordination eats 100% of the energy. The company is spending all of its time just talking to itself about what to do, and nothing actually gets done. It's an entire corporation made of energy. So how do we survive that? Because we just proved that the human prefrontal cortex burns out at 105 edges. You can't just hire more humans.
To survive scaling past the biological limit, you must cross the epistemic boundary to organizational chemistry. You must deploy what the text calls digital stigmergy.
Digital Stigmergy. I was trying to wrap my head around this. So we've stopped the bleeding by turning the executive into a Maxwell's demon, but to actually scale to a massive global corporation without hitting the event horizon, we have to offload the demon's job entirely to silicon.
Exactly. You must shift the thermodynamic burden of state maintenance entirely into silicon-based data structures to permanently destroy the ON² constraint. You bypass Landauer's limit on the biological brain by letting digital infrastructure absorb the erasure costs. Computers don't run on the astrocyte neuron lactate shuttle. They don't suffer from active inference.
So the era of heuristic poetry is officially over. The era of exact biophysical computation begins now. Calculate your friction, protect your exergy, offload the thermodynamics to silicon.
It is the only physical way forward for the modern enterprise.
So what does this all mean? We are wrapping up this massive 8-part diagnostic journal today. You, listening to this right now, possess the literal physics blueprint to reclaim your share of that $9.6 trillion global deficit. You know how to stop the thermodynamic leap.
You are no longer managing a poem. You are an architect governing a physical engine.
And as we close this out, I want to leave you with a final, completely novel, highly provocative implication built on the physics we discussed today. Something for you to really mull over as you look at your own teams.
I think the framework demands a paradigm shift, so let's hear it.
If human resistance to change is actually a thermodynamic defense mechanism, active inference deployed automatically by the brain to prevent cellular ATP starvation, then employee burnout isn't a medical condition. It's not a psychological failing to be treated by a doctor or a therapist or a wellness app. Burnout is an industrial injury caused by a negligent architect.
I wouldn't even call that a metaphor. Based on the biophysics, that is a literal statement of fact. It is a structural injury.
So what happens to the global economy when we finally start treating corporate mismanagement and the overutilization of human computing nodes as a literal workplace safety violation under the laws of physics? Because right now, that $9.6 trillion is just evaporating into the void while we pretend it's a culture problem. And until today, we've been trying to fix a murky, invisible diagnostic landscape. But now we have the physical X-ray.
The X-ray clearly shows the structural fracture. The only question left is whether modern leadership actually has the courage to set the bone.
Thank you for joining us on this incredible 8-part deep dive. We'll see you on the other side of the event horizon.